Welcome to CEO Confidential from Frank Pagano and Pierangelo Soldavini.
And welcome also from me. Today we are talking about marketing and leadership.
And we have the pleasure, the honor to have with us a true business rock star. Adam, welcome to the show. Right off the bat, who are you and what do you do for a living?
Well, listen, thank you both. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And of course, it's such a good question. Who are you and what do you do? Because it implies there's only one answer. So from a business point of view, I think I am four things. I'm a slashy. So I'm a marketing consultant. I am an obsessive book writer. I wish I wasn't, but I can't seem to get rid of it. It's just an itch I have to scratch. I'm a strategic facilitator. And I'm a tool maker, I think, overall. I like to make useful tools that people can bring and apply to their own businesses and jobs.
And you also created Eatbigfish. And this is my first question. What is the idea and philosophy behind Eatbigfish?
So I came out of advertising. I had spent 17 years in advertising agencies, always working on the number 2 or 3 or 4 brand. And I realized after a while that in search of learning and inspiration for them, nobody was writing about these brands. They were writing about leaders. It's hard to imagine now, but 21 years ago, people wrote about IBM, they wrote about Coke, they wrote about big American leaders, as if we could learn from those. So I decided, actually, I'd always worked on the 2 or 3 or the 4 brand. I wanted to write an operating system for this kind of challenger brand. And so I took a sabbatical of 6 months and I researched and wrote a book about 50 challenger brands and what they had in common. And I thought I'll just launch it out there and see. And it took off and I started a business on it. And so now my company is a small family business, as it were, 22 of us. But we specialize in helping clients be more challenger, adopt more of a challenger mindset and see their issues, their cultural issues, their strategic issues, their innovation issues through a challenger mindset.
Yes, and Adam, for this challenge, I think I suppose you have to understand the market and in some way the collective will of people. What is for you collective will?
I think collective will is a profoundly important and understudied concept. So if you talk about companies, groups of people that make change or accelerate businesses, and you particularly talk about challengers, there's an assumption there's always one person who is the kind of owner driver of that solution. And of course, for a while, there was a cult of the solo maverick CEO, epitomized, of course, by Steve Jobs. That is not the situation with most of us. And therefore, there's a excuse that most of us give about, well, we can't make those kinds of changes. We can't make those kinds of transitions. We don't have that kind of visionary solo maverick person who's driving us by the scruff of our necks forward. And actually, there are plenty of examples of challengers, of change agents, of transformation accelerators, which are not individuals, but are of collectives. But it needs a collective will in an organization at some level. And I think part of the great skill of leadership today is the ability to forge and create and feed and nurture that collective will. And it's not just within an organization, is it? Because if you look at, for instance, the aviation industry faces enormous challenge, right? In terms of if we want to keep going, we have to answer some very big questions about sustainable flying. How can we make planes more sustainable? No one company on their own can solve that problem. It will take the collective will of the entire industry to solve that problem for all of them and for us. So collective will in leaning into the really big strategic questions we as individual businesses or collectively as kind of future-facing 21st century industries face will require a forging and a keeping and a nurturing of collective will.
Yes, I would like to confront with you with another strategic issue, because after the COVID, especially, we are confronting with a huge number of new constraints. So, how about to win these new constraints that are leading us to a new world?
Yes, I have changed my view about constraints almost completely in the last 6 years. So I was interested in writing a book about challenges and innovation. And increasingly, when you look at challenges and innovation, what strikes you is they are innovating without an innovation department. And very often they're innovating without a lot of other basics you might think of as well. They might not have the best product in the category, for instance, or the largest sales force or marketing team. So constraint for a challenger is an integral part of how they need to progress. And they progress often not despite the constraint, but spurred on in some way by the constraint. So constraint has a very bad reputation. If we did a word association now between us about what words you associate with constraint, they would be bad words. They would be words that were about limitation, restricting our ability to be everything we could be, that kind of thing. In fact, if you look at any kind of creativity in the broadest sense of it, or breakthrough, it is almost invariably spurred by the combination of a big ambition and a significant constraint operating together. So I researched a few years ago how constraints stimulated breakthrough, and in a wide area of fields, not so much, funnily enough, pure creativity, more to do with agriculture, yes, some to do with marketing, car manufacture, and looked at what the commonalities were. And there were three key things that they shared, really, these companies that had turned constraints into opportunity. One was they put the constraint at the heart of their thinking. So normally when you do blue sky brainstormings, you take the constraints out of the room and you think about what the answer to the problem could be if we didn't have any constraints. They didn't do that. They put the constraint right in the middle, along with that big ambition, and said, how can these two things coexist? And that forces us cognitively to question the assumptions that we've all been making about the relationship between these two things that may not exist. The second thing that they all do is they adopt what one of the people I interviewed called a Canif approach. He said, when we're dealing with constraints, I don't allow anybody to start a sentence with the words, we can't do that because. We have to start the conversation, we can do that if. And that's it seems a very simple thing to say. It's such a powerful reframing of the conversation we're having. We're not having a conversation about whether it is possible to do this. We're having a conversation about under what circumstances we can make this happen. That's a very liberating way to think about it. And then the third part of it is really recognizing that although we think we're constrained in terms of resources, budget, media, talent, actually around us, there are plenty of resources that are just currently owned by other people. So all we have to do is work out how to access that and make them want to let those resources flow our way. So I think it is the ability to turn constraint into opportunity is a replicable skill. I think it's a series of strategies. And it's a series of strategies that is important to us as business people, but also to us as human beings. We're all going to be faced, like it or not, with a whole series of constraints in our personal lives that we haven't had to face before. And of course, as global citizens, I think this is an enormously important skill if I'm honest, I think it should be taught in schools. I think it's so fundamental to our success and happiness in life, all aspects of life.
Adam, on that note, you're an expert exactly on challenger thinking. And what is the resonance of that in 2020? And do you have concrete examples of who's doing that well?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If you look at what the effects of 2020, people talk about as a kind of K-shaped recession, right? And the two arcs of the K. There's people who aren't doing so well. There's businesses who need to completely temporarily pivot or rethink what they're doing. And then there are people who are doing well, and some of the people who are doing well on that upward stroke of the K, some are quite predictable, PayPal, for instance, okay, so e-commerce, but some of them are less predictable. So you look at old-fashioned packaged goods brands, right? So big kind of companies, Frank, you and I used to work in kind of historically, they've had a bounce because there's been a retreat to comfort. There's been a retreat to brands that we know and understand, tins of things, stuff that people thought were unfashionable because they were buying those trendy little artisanal new brands, that were popping up in the supermarket. They've had a bounce. They've found themselves on the upward arc of that K. And so they are looking at, how do we stop this being a temporary bounce? How do we use this to reignite our own challenger mindset and say, how can we keep going upwards? Because the world will come back again. All those trends about, little artisanal brands with stories, they will all come back again. Those trends will come back in. How can we maintain that upward arc? So for them, maintaining a challenger mindset is about how can we stimulate ourselves to stop thinking like a legacy company and start to think like that challenger we perhaps were 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of people on the downward arc who they need to completely rethink some of their assumptions about what their business model was, what their marketing model is, where their consumers are, what their go-to-market model. If you're a hammer, you see everything as a nail. I specialize in challenges. I love challenges. I think both of those kinds of businesses on the upward and downward arc of that K need to adopt a challenger mindset because everything is in transition, right? Everything is in transition, and we don't know how permanent that transition is or not, but we know that we will not go back to the way things were 9 months ago.
A little bit about the future, Adam. What are you working on? What are the areas of thinking or research that will be relevant for us or for our leaders in the next immediate future?
So one of the things I suppose I'm fascinated by is that for all the understanding and expertise and emphasis on, for instance, things like technology, our basic ability to communicate, whether it's in marketing, whether it's internally in terms of motivating people, doesn't seem to have got any more engaging. If you stop and look at, for instance, let's just very crudely say, as consumers of advertising, if you stop and look at advertising, you would have thought over the past 50 years that actually the quality of engagement and interest in advertising would have dramatically increased with the amount of time people have spent thinking about it. It hasn't. And so what intrigues me at the moment is how can we all be more interesting? How can we be more engaging in what we do? How do we stop being dull? So I am researching people whose jobs it is to make dull subjects interesting. So for instance, science teachers, right? If you're a science teacher talking to 13-year-old children and trying to explain polynomial equations to them when they don't want to know, you have two basic skills, right? One is behavior management. You've got to stop them running riot in the classroom. The second is how to make a dull subject interesting. And if you can't do that, you're simply not going to educate them. I've been interviewing people who are teaching minors in South Africa about financial literacy. So this is not a subject that is top of their agenda. They have safety issues that they need to learn first, but clearly they absolutely have to understand how to provide for their families and for their children. And they're from many cultures, many languages, quite finite degrees of education. So they have to find a way to make a very dull subject interesting to them. And so by collecting all of these people who specialize in making dull subjects interesting, I'm trying to look at what are the rules for how we can all be much more engaging. And I would argue too, actually, in a post-COVID world, this is more important than ever. The guy who teaches the minors, and he teaches them safety through what's called industrial theatre. They put on plays to teach them safety practices in these mines in South Africa. He says, when it's a matter of life and death, you can't afford to be dull. And I think for all of us, as we move forward into the new world, it's kind of a matter of life and death, how we come out of this thing. And as we come out of it, we can't afford to be dull. So that's my new love.
Amazing. I'm going to shift gears, Adam, if I can. And next question. What is leadership and who's a leader for you?
So leadership is isn't it? It's such a wonderfully interesting question, because there are so many answers to it. And I love the George Box quote about all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is my model. So it may be wrong, but it's useful. So for me, leadership is about the abilities you give to other people. It's not the abilities you have yourself. And at the moment, therefore, I would say leadership is about three things, really. One is the ability to give a group of people confidence to navigate a transition. And that's hard, right? Giving them managing a transition is one thing, giving them confidence to navigate is one thing. Secondly, giving them the ability to understand as they manage that transition what is risk and what is responsibility. Because as you move through a period of change, what you thought was risk and what you thought was responsible actions, they often flip over. Actually, the thing that 2 years ago was the most responsible thing you could do can now be the most risky thing you can do. So helping them see and understand that, I think, is a quality of leadership. And the third one, to revert back to one of our earlier questions, is the ability to forge collective will in them and to nurture collective will in them. Not to say, trust me, we'll be fine, but actually to get them to trust themselves and to see it through collectively. I think for me are the three qualities of leadership I would most prize at the moment.
So Adam, you introduced the rule of three, and I'm keeping on it. Translating the leadership in the business world, which are the three must-have factors, features of the CEO of the future?
Okay, I've got three. All right, so I think the first is an eternal one, which is the ability to see what the real issue is, right? The ability to distinguish between strategy and tactics, therefore. I'm astonished at how few people do that and how utterly essential it is. I used to have a client who had started every meeting with the question, what is the real issue here? And it's a really useful discipline. And it's amazing how initially unprepared you are actually to answer that question. And then you get much better at answering it because you know he's going to ask you every time. I found that a very useful kind of question to go into. The second, I think, is that thought about constraint, actually. There was a Harvard Business Review published a book, a little book that they sold in airports a few years ago, which was the 10 most important articles published in the Harvard Business Review about leadership. And I bought it for a bit of airplane reading. And I thought, I'm interested to see how often the word constraint comes up in here. Because surely how to help your teams manage, get comfortable with, turn constraints into opportunities, surely that is an integral part of how we all live today. The word constraint was not mentioned once in the entire thing. And yet I think for me, if you look at the great leaders, you look at what Nike have done, you look at what IKEA have done, for instance, what Paul Polman did at Unilever in terms of setting these big ambitions and putting big constraints in there, often about sustainability, for instance, it starts from that, and getting the company excited about leaning into that and seeing it as a competitive advantage. That for me is a kind of key quality of leadership and being a great CEO. And then finally, I think, and again, I would say this, I think recognizing that we all need to have the ability to flex between a leader mindset and a challenger mindset. So I think there are times in very large organizations when you do need to think and act like a leader and have the responsibilities of a leader. But equally, increasingly, there will be either times or places where you need to help the organization think like a challenger. And I think the ability to understand both of those and be fluent in both those languages of leadership, if you like, is the third attribute I think that should characterize a CEO today.
And coming to your experience, you have your own business. How difficult it was to go alone, and if you have any tips for young CEOs and young entrepreneurs who are leaving the challenge to eat big fish?
Yes, so I should say I'm a reluctant entrepreneur. I am not one of those people who always had a dream to start their own business. I was not that person. I took some time. I wrote this book called Eating the Big Fish, about challenges, because I'm obsessed with writing books, as I said earlier on. And I wanted it to be the book that my company used, my big advertising agency used to describe themselves. And by the time I finished it, 18 months later, they didn't want it anymore. They changed their mind. So I'm a really easygoing guy, but for 8 months I was driven by anger and bile. And I wanted to show them that there was an idea in here. So I left the company. So what I had was a point of view, a very strong point of view, because I'd spent a lot of time thinking about this challenger angle. So my first piece of advice is you need a really strong point of view. I think people often confuse having a technology or an idea with having a strong point of view, a perspective. And I think having that really clear perspective that you bring to everything you do is absolutely essential, because it allows you to define who you're for and who you're not for, what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. It allows you to make very clear choices. The second thing is to be very clear about the first 2 or 3 projects you take on, because they will define you whether you like it or not. They will define you because you'll staff to feed them, because they'll become your first case history, so you get other people like that. So I was really selective about who I worked with and who I didn't. And of course, when you're starting out as an entrepreneur, it's hard to be selective, right? Because you've got mouths to feed. You've got a paranoia that no one's ever going to want to work with you, that you need to, oh, thank God, I'll get them, So being really selective about what you do and don't do. And then the third point, I think, is this thing about resource. So I came across this very late in my entrepreneurial career, but I love the definition of entrepreneurship from the dean of entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School, the man who founded that school, Professor Stevenson. And he had a single definition for entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship, clearly, you can define in lots of different ways. You can define it as self-starter, full of ideas, agile, all those kinds of things. He said, let's just define it as one thing. Let's define entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. The pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. And so for me, collaboration, partnership, the ability to use my network to reach out and get other people to help me advance my own agenda has been a revelation. And I wish I'd learned it 21 years ago rather than 10 years ago. And of course, it's so easy to do now. But I think people don't understand what collaboration really is. They think collaboration is McDonald's putting a rapper's name on a Happy Meal and pretending it's some link between them. That's celebrity endorsement. Deeper collaboration where each side is learning from each other and genuinely participating and having a kind of culture and a value and an idea exchange, I think that is absolutely integral to the future. And I am doing it now, and I wish I'd done it much earlier.
Adam, I'm going to ask for a strong point of view also for this question. We have an opinion here, so if you want to change things, you need new technologies, sustainability, marketing, or leadership. You only have one bullet. Where would you start?
I'll give you 2 answers to that. So my one bullet would be to say I wouldn't pick any of those bullets. I'd pick a challenger mindset. I think a challenger mindset is the reset mentality that requires you to use any of those 4 bullets in the right direction, in the right way.
Adam, the very last question, I would like to change a little bit the point of view. We are living in a challenging environment, of course, as you underline more times. We need the innovation, and we understand that without innovation and digitalization, we cannot survive in this new environment. Which is, from your point of view, the biggest obstacle to change?
That's such a good question. I think it's I think there are two or three. So when you look at when I did my work into constraints, I identified three barriers to people's resistance to seeing constraints potentially as opportunities. So one was they didn't believe it was possible. The second was they didn't know how to do it. And the third is they didn't want to do it, right? That isn't what I signed up for. That sounds really difficult. Of all of those, I think you can change people wanting to do it quite easily. That's just a question of leadership and motivation. I think you can show people that it's possible. There are lots of really inspiring examples that are quite accessible of people who've made these transformations. So for me, giving people, I go back to my point about being a tool maker, giving people just enough process, not telling them exactly what to do. They have to go on that journey as a group themselves, but just enough structure that gets them from the first corner to the second corner to the middle of the street to the lamppost to the next, just helping them along that journey, I think is the hardest thing to do. People tend to say, it's great, we'll set a big vision and then we'll start them off the first 100 days. And it's not. It's a series of smaller steps, isn't it? So that for me seems very obvious, but that's the key, I think. Just enough process.
So I would like to thank really Adam Morgan for his opinion, for his views from a reluctant entrepreneur. That could be the title of his new book, I suppose. And from me and Frank Pagano, really thank you. And thank you to all who has been with us today. And see you next time with CEO Confidential.
Thank you.
Thank you.